The gunshot tore through the stillness of the Montana dusk, echoing across the valley like thunder as Daisy Zimmerman fled through the pine forest, her torn calico dress catching on brambles, breath coming in desperate gasps. It was 1877, and she had finally done what she'd sworn never to do. She'd left Victor Reeves. Left the man who'd promised to love her but had only delivered pain since the day they'd wed 3 years ago. Blood trickled down her temple where his wedding ring had split her skin, but she kept running, the small leather pouch of emergency savings clutched in her trembling hand. "Daisy," Victor's voice boomed through the trees. "You come back here, woman. No wife of mine runs off like some thieving harlot." Another shot cracked through the twilight, this one closer, sending splinters of bark flying from a tree trunk mere inches from her head. Daisy stifled a scream and veered west toward the neighboring ranch. She'd never spoken more than a few words to the Preston Fletcher who'd purchased the old McAllister place last spring. But she'd seen him in town, tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he tipped his hat to the ladies outside the general store. She prayed he was the decent sort. She prayed he was home. Daisy's lungs burned as she stumbled across the boundary line between properties, marked by a dilapidated fence that had seen better days. The Fletcher ranch appeared before her, moonlight illuminating the weathered 2-story house, barn, and outbuildings. No lamps glowed in the windows. Her heart sank. But then she spotted smoke curling from the chimney of the Smokehouse, a small structure set apart from the main buildings. Victor's voice carried from the forest behind her, closer now. "I see you, Daisy, running to another man's property. Is that where you've been sneaking off to, that new rancher?" The crack of another gunshot decided for her. Daisy sprinted toward the Smokehouse, yanked open the heavy wooden door, and slipped inside. The warm, pungent aroma of curing meat enveloped her as she closed the door quietly behind her. Rows of venison and beef hung from hooks in the rafters, the smoky haze stinging her eyes. She crouched in the corner behind a barrel, making herself as small as possible, and pressed a hand to her mouth to quiet her breathing. Through a small gap in the wooden planks, she could see Victor emerge from the tree line, rifle raised, his face contorted with rage even in the dim moonlight. "Daisy," he bellowed, turning in a slow circle. "I know you're here somewhere. You think that Fletcher man will help you. He'll send you right back where you belong to your husband." Daisy closed her eyes, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Victor hadn't always been this way. When they'd first met at a church social in Helena, he'd been charming, attentive. It wasn't until after their wedding that the drinking started, followed by the accusations, the jealousy, and finally, the beatings. The Smokehouse door creaked open suddenly, flooding the small space with moonlight. Daisy curled tighter behind the barrel, a whimper escaping despite herself. "Hello," a deep voice called softly. "Anyone in here?" Through her fingers, Daisy could make out the silhouette of a tall man framed in the doorway, a shotgun held casually at his side. Preston Fletcher had returned from wherever he'd been. "I heard gunshots," he continued, stepping inside and peering into the shadows. "And I don't much care for trespassers firing weapons on my property." Daisy remained frozen, uncertain whether to reveal herself. What if he was friends with Victor? What if he believed a husband had every right to discipline his wife? A floorboard creaked as Preston moved deeper into the Smokehouse. The moonlight caught his profile's strong jaw dusted with stubble, straight nose, brow furrowed in concentration. He looked about 30 with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His gaze swept the room and stopped on her hiding place. Their eyes met through the shadows. "Please," Daisy whispered, fresh tears spilling. "Please don't tell him I'm here." Preston Fletcher's expression shifted from surprise to concern. He moved swiftly to her side, crouching down. When he saw her battered face, his jaw tightened. "He won't hurt you again," he whispered, his voice a solemn promise that sent an unexpected shiver down Daisy's spine. The sound of boots stomping across the yard reached them. Preston straightened up and placed a gentle hand on Daisy's shoulder. "Stay here, don't make a sound." He moved toward the door, positioning himself to block any view of the interior. "Fletcher," Victor's voice boomed, "you seen my wife? Blonde hair, blue dress. She's run off in a fit of hysteria." Daisy held her breath, heart hammering against her ribs. "Can't say that I have," Preston replied, his tone neutral. Mind explaining why you're on my property after dark, waving a rifle and firing shots? Family business, Victor snapped. She needs to come home where she belongs. Well, she's not here, Preston said, and I'll thank you to conduct your family business elsewhere. The next shot I hear on my land will be answered in kind. Victor's voice dropped to a menacing growl. You hiding her, Fletcher, because if I find out you're lying to me, that sounds remarkably like a threat, Preston cut in. I don't take kindly to threats, especially from men who hunt their wives like animals. Now I suggest you leave my property. Dawn's coming soon. You'll have better luck searching in the daylight. A tense silence followed, then Victor spat on the ground. This isn't over. For tonight it is, Preston replied evenly. Daisy listened to Victor's retreating footsteps, too afraid to move, too afraid to hope. Only when the sound had faded completely did Preston return to her side. He's gone for now, he said, offering his hand. But he'll be back. Men like that always come back. Daisy accepted his help, her legs unsteady as she rose to her feet. Thank you, she whispered, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door. In the faint light, she saw him shake his head. You didn't bring the trouble, madam. The trouble followed you. He guided her toward the door, peering out cautiously before leading her across the yard to the main house. Inside, Preston lit an oil lamp, its golden glow revealing a modest but tidy home. Daisy stood awkwardly in the front room, suddenly conscious of her torn dress, disheveled hair, and bruised face. Sit, please, Preston said, gesturing to a worn armchair beside the fireplace. I'll stoke the fire and put on some coffee. As he busied himself with the hearth, Daisy took the opportunity to study him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work, his movements efficient yet unhurried. His clothes were simple denims, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up exposing strong forearms and worn boots. I'm Daisy, she offered quietly. Daisy Zimmerman. Preston Fletcher, he replied, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile, though I reckon you knew that already. Everyone in the valley knows about the Easterner who bought the McAllister place, she said. Preston chuckled. Easterner, I'm from Colorado. That's east of Montana, Daisy pointed out, a tiny smile tugging at her lips despite everything. Fair enough. The fire caught, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Preston rose and moved to the kitchen area where he set a pot of coffee on the stove. Are you hungry? Daisy hadn't eaten since noon, but the thought of food made her stomach clench with anxiety. No, thank you. Preston studied her for a moment, then reached for a tin on a shelf. Some biscuits, at least. You need your strength. The simple act of kindness nearly undid her. Daisy accepted the offered biscuit with trembling fingers, biting her lip to keep from crying again. He's your husband. Preston asked after a moment, his voice gentle but direct. Daisy nodded, eyes downcast. 3 years now. How long has he been hitting you? The bluntness of the question startled her. Most people pretended not to notice the bruises or worse, suggested that she must have done something to deserve them. 2 years, 7 months, she answered quietly. It started right after we moved out here from Helena. Preston's expression darkened. And tonight. Daisy's hand went unconsciously to the cut on her temple. He found money I'd been hiding, a little at a time from selling eggs and butter in town. He thought I was saving it to run away with another man. Were you? Preston asked, his tone neutral. I was saving it to run away, she admitted, meeting his gaze directly. But there's no other man, there's never been anyone but Victor. The coffee began to boil. Preston poured 2 cups, adding a generous splash of whiskey to both before handing one to Daisy. She accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. What will you do now? He asked, settling into the chair opposite hers. The question hung in the air between them. Daisy had been so focused on escaping that she hadn't thought beyond this moment. I don't know, she confessed. I have family back east, but no money for passage, and Victor would find me in town before I could arrange anything. Preston sipped his coffee thoughtfully. You could stay here, until you figure things out. Daisy's head snapped up. I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition, he interrupted gently. I've got the space, and it would be the last place he'd look. Why would you help me? Daisy asked, searching his face. You don't even know me. Preston was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I had a sister, he finally said, his voice low. Catherine, she married young to a man who seemed perfect on Sundays but was the devil himself the rest of the week. By the time any of us realized what was happening, it was too late. He'd isolated her, convinced her she deserved it. His eyes, when they met Daisy's, held a sorrow so profound it stole her breath. She took her own life rather than endure another day with him. "I'm so sorry," Daisy whispered. "I couldn't help her," Preston continued, "but maybe I can help you." In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition, a shared understanding of pain and its aftermath. Daisy felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. "Just until I can make other arrangements," she agreed. Preston nodded. "There's a spare room upstairs. It's not much, but it's clean." He showed her to a small bedroom at the end of the hallway. Simple furnishings, a narrow bed, a dresser, a chair by the window, but to Daisy, who had spent the last hours fearing for her life, it looked like paradise. "There are some of Catherine's clothes in the dresser," Preston said, lingering in the doorway. "She was about your size. Use whatever you need." Daisy turned to thank him, but the words caught in her throat at the expression on his face, a complex mixture of grief, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Get some rest," he said softly. "We'll figure out the next steps in the morning." After he left, Daisy changed into a simple cotton nightgown she found in the dresser. It felt strange to wear another woman's clothes, especially one whose story had ended so tragically. She offered a silent prayer for Catherine before climbing into bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor's face contorted with rage, heard the crack of his gunshots. Dawn was breaking when she finally drifted off, her last conscious thought a wonder at how quickly life could change, how in the space of a night, a stranger could become a sanctuary. Morning sunlight streamed through the curtains when Daisy awakened, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back as she sat up, wincing at the soreness in her muscles from her desperate flight through the forest. The house was quiet as she dressed in one of Catherine's simple day dresses, a butter yellow cotton that was perhaps a touch too short but otherwise fit well enough. She plaited her hair and washed her face in the basin, careful around the cut on her temple. Downstairs, she found a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to check the herd, help yourself to breakfast, back by noon. P.F." The domesticity of the moment struck Daisy as surreal. 24 hours ago, she had been making breakfast for Victor in their cabin, walking on eggshells, dreading his inevitable criticism. Now she was alone in a stranger's house, free to move about without fear. She found eggs and bacon in the icebox and set about preparing a simple meal, finding a curious comfort in the familiar routine. By the time she heard the sound of hooves in the yard, she had not only eaten but also swept the floors and washed the breakfast dishes. Preston entered, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. He paused when he saw her, his expression unreadable. "I hope you don't mind," Daisy said, suddenly uncertain. "I wanted to make myself useful." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not at all. Place hasn't been this clean since." "Well, in a long while. I made coffee," she offered, gesturing to the pot keeping warm on the stove. "That would be welcome." He crossed to the wash basin to clean his hands. "Did you sleep?" Eventually, Daisy admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." Preston accepted the cup she handed him, their fingers brushing briefly. "I rode the property line this morning. No sign of your husband. He'll be looking," Daisy said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Victor doesn't give up easily. Neither do I." Preston took a seat at the table, indicating she should join him. "We need to talk about what happens next." Daisy sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. "I was thinking about that. I have an aunt in Boston. She might take me in, help me find work." "Boston's a long way," Preston observed. "Do you have enough saved for the journey?" Daisy reached for the small leather pouch she'd kept with her. $43. "It's not enough for a train ticket, but maybe I could work my way east. Take positions as a cook or housekeeper along the way," Preston frowned. "That's a dangerous proposition for a woman traveling alone, especially one whose husband might be in pursuit." "I don't have many options," Daisy said softly. "You could stay here," Preston suggested, his tone carefully neutral, "not just for a few days." "I mean until we can resolve this situation properly." "Resolve it how?" Daisy asked, her throat suddenly dry. Preston took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "There are legal avenues. Divorce is difficult but not impossible, especially in cases of cruelty. Judge Miller in Helena is a fair man. With the right evidence and testimony, you might be granted one. Victor would never agree, Daisy said, shaking her head. And even if by some miracle he did, where would I go afterward? What would I live on? I told you, Preston said, his eyes meeting hers steadily. You can stay here. I've got plenty of room and I could use the help around the place. A ranch this size needs more than one pair of hands to run properly. The offer tempted Daisy more than she cared to admit. Not just for the practical reasons shelter, safety, a means to support herself, but because something about Preston Fletcher made her feel secure in a way she hadn't since before her marriage. People would talk, she said finally. A single woman living with a single man. Let them, Preston replied with a shrug. I've never much cared for gossip, but if it bothers you, we could say you're my widowed cousin, come to help after the loss of your husband. Daisy considered this. That might work, at least until Victor shows up in town asking questions. By then, we'll have a better plan, Preston assured her. For now, the important thing is keeping you safe. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Daisy's heart leapt into her throat as Preston moved swiftly to the window. 2 riders, he reported, his voice tight. One's the sheriff, the other. Victor, Daisy whispered, rising from her chair. Preston turned to her, his expression grim. Go upstairs, stay out of sight. But trust me, he said, reaching for his gun belt hanging by the door. I won't let him take you. Daisy hurried up the stairs, pausing at the top to peer through the small landing window. Sheriff Donovan Mills, a grizzled veteran of the frontier, dismounted first, followed by Victor. Even from a distance, Daisy could see the rigid anger in her husband's posture. From her hiding place, she could hear the men's voices, though not their exact words. The conversation seemed tense but controlled. After what felt like an eternity, the horses departed. Daisy remained frozen until Preston's footsteps sounded on the stairs. He found her clutching the banister, her knuckles white. They're gone, he said, his face grave. For now. What did they want? Daisy asked, already knowing the answer. Victor claims you stole money from him, says you're unstable and need to come home where he can care for you properly. Preston's disgust was evident in his tone. Sheriff seemed skeptical but said he had to investigate the complaint. And what did you tell them? Daisy held her breath. That I haven't seen hide nor hair of you. That if you were smart enough to run from a man like Victor, you were smart enough not to come to the nearest neighbor's place. A small smile crossed Preston's face. Mills is no fool. I think he knows what kind of man Victor is. He made a show of looking around the yard but didn't ask to search the house. Relief flooded through Daisy, but it was short-lived. Victor won't give up. He'll be watching the property. Probably, Preston agreed, which means we need to be careful. No going outside during daylight for a while. No lighting lamps near windows at night. The reality of her situation settled heavily on Daisy's shoulders. She was essentially a prisoner again, not by Victor's hand this time, but by his threat. I'm sorry, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. Preston reached out hesitantly, then seemed to think better of it, his hand falling back to his side. You've brought no trouble that wasn't already mine to bear, he said quietly. The moment I learned what kind of man lived next door, this became my fight too. Something in his words, in the quiet intensity with which he spoke them, touched Daisy deeply. For the first time since fleeing her home, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps this nightmare might eventually end. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Preston nodded once, then gestured toward the kitchen. Come on, let's make a plan for the days ahead. Over the next week, Daisy and Preston fell into an uneasy routine. She remained indoors, occupying herself with cooking, cleaning, and mending Preston's clothes, tasks familiar from her married life, but transformed by the absence of fear. Preston continued his regular ranch work during the day, returning at dusk with reports of any unusual activity in the area. Victor had been spotted in town several times, asking questions, making vague threats about what he'd do when he found his runaway wife. He'd even posted a notice at the general store offering a reward for information leading to Daisy's whereabouts. $10 is a lot of money around these parts, Preston observed one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. Someone might be tempted to talk if they suspect you're here. Do you think anyone does? Daisy asked, looking up from the shirt she was patching. Preston considered the question. Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile gave me a strange look today when I bought flour and sugar, said she didn't realize I had such a sweet tooth. Daisy's hands stilled. What did you tell her? That I've developed a fondness for pie, he replied with a small smile. It's not a lie. Your apple pie yesterday was the best I've had since leaving Colorado. A blush crept up Daisy's cheeks at the compliment. Such moments had been occurring more frequently, small, shared smiles, casual touches that lingered a moment too long, conversations that stretched into the night as they revealed pieces of themselves to each other. Daisy learned that Preston had come to Montana seeking a fresh start after losing not only his sister, but also his parents within the span of 2 years. He'd inherited enough money to buy the ranch and a decent herd of cattle, determined to build something lasting in this wild country. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, her father's death that had left the family destitute, forcing her mother to send Daisy west to live with an uncle in Helena. It was there she'd met Victor, who'd seemed like salvation at the time, handsome, established, promising security and family. I was so naive, Daisy said one night, staring into the flames. I mistook possession for passion, control for caring. Preston, seated in the chair opposite, watched her with those thoughtful eyes that seemed to see beyond her words. Love and fear can look remarkably similar to the inexperienced heart. His insight startled her. Yes, she agreed softly, that's exactly it. As April turned to May, the tension of Victor's continued presence in the area was balanced by a growing comfort between Daisy and Preston. The house, which had felt like a temporary shelter at first, began to feel like something more permanent. She found herself imagining a future here not just as a guest in hiding, but as someone who belonged. It was a dangerous thought. She was still a married woman, still legally bound to a man who considered her his property. And Preston, for all his kindness, had never suggested he saw her as anything more than someone in need of protection. Yet there were moments like when their hands brushed as she passed him a cup of coffee, or when she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster, that made her wonder if perhaps he felt the subtle shift between them too. The turning point came on a warm evening in late May. Preston had ridden to town for supplies and returned with news that sent a chill through Daisy despite the spring warmth. Victor's telling people he's leaving the territory, Preston reported, pacing the kitchen while Daisy prepared dinner. Says there's nothing left for him here now that his poor, disturbed wife has run off. Daisy set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. You don't believe him? Not for a second, Preston confirmed. It's a ploy. He thinks if word gets back to you that he's leaving, you'll come out of hiding. Or, Daisy suggested, a new fear taking root. He's saying it publicly while planning to search more aggressively in private. If everyone believes he's given up. No one will question his movements, Preston finished grimly. We need to be more careful than ever. That night, Preston insisted on sleeping downstairs, his rifle within reach. Daisy lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the occasional creak of floorboards as Preston made his rounds, checking windows and doors. Shortly after midnight, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Daisy bolted upright, heart pounding. Footsteps thundered up the stairs as Preston called her name. Get dressed, he ordered, appearing in her doorway. Quickly, someone's trying to break in through the kitchen. Daisy's fingers fumbled with buttons as she pulled on a dress over her nightgown. Victor. Can't tell, Preston replied, checking the ammunition in his rifle. But I'm not waiting to find out. We're leaving. Leaving, Daisy echoed, hastily gathering her few possessions. I've got a hunting cabin about 10 miles north up in the foothills, Preston explained. Remote, hard to find if you don't know where to look. We'll go there until I can figure out a more permanent solution. The sound of splintering wood from below spurred them into action. Preston led Daisy down the back stairs that opened onto a small landing near the root cellar. They slipped out into the night, keeping low as they made their way to the barn. Hold this, Preston whispered, handing Daisy his rifle while he saddled 2 horses with remarkable speed. Ever ridden astride? Daisy shook her head. Like most women, she'd only ever ridden side saddle. No time to worry about propriety, Preston said, helping her mount a sturdy roan mare. Just hold on tight and follow my lead." They rode out the back of the barn, keeping to the shadows of the tree line. Behind them, a shout rang out, followed by the orange glow of flames. Daisy turned in horror to see smoke pouring from the kitchen window of Preston's house. "He's burning it down," she gasped. Preston's face, illuminated briefly by the distant fire, was a mask of cold fury. "Keep riding," he instructed. "Don't look back." They rode hard for nearly an hour, following game trails and creek beds to mask their trail. The terrain grew steeper, more rugged as they entered the foothills. Finally, Preston signaled for them to slow. "Not much further," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the horses' labored breathing. "There's a stream up ahead where we can rest the horses." The cabin, when they reached it just before dawn, was little more than a one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a small covered porch fronted the single door. "It's not much," Preston apologized as he helped Daisy dismount, her legs trembling from the unaccustomed ride. "But it's solid and no one knows about it except me." Inside, the cabin was spare but serviceable: a stone fireplace, a narrow bed pushed against one wall, a table and 2 chairs, a few shelves stocked with basic supplies. Preston quickly built a fire while Daisy stood in the center of the room, suddenly overwhelmed by the night's events. "He burned your home," she said, her voice breaking. "Because of me." Preston straightened from the hearth, the fire catching behind him. "No," he said firmly, "because of him, because he's the kind of man who destroys what he can't control." Tears spilled down Daisy's cheeks. "Everything you had, not everything," Preston interrupted, crossing to stand before her. "The house can be rebuilt. The things inside were just that, things." He hesitated, then gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "What matters is that you're safe." The tenderness of the gesture, the warmth in his eyes, broke something open inside Daisy. Without thinking, she stepped forward into his arms, burying her face against his chest. After a moment's surprise, Preston's arms came around her, strong and secure. "I'm so tired of being afraid," she whispered against his shirt. His hand came up to stroke her hair. "I know," he murmured. "I know." They stood like that for a long moment, the only sounds the crackling fire and their synchronized breathing. When Daisy finally pulled back, something had changed between them, a boundary crossed, a new understanding reached. "You should rest," Preston said softly. "Take the bed, I'll keep watch." Exhausted beyond measure, Daisy didn't argue. She removed only her boots before lying down on the narrow bed. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Preston sitting by the fire, his profile strong and steady in the flickering light. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Preston stood at the small stove, his back to her. "Good morning," Daisy said, her voice husky with sleep. He turned, a smile warming his features. "Good morning. I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away." "What time is it?" She sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Just past noon," Preston replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "You needed the rest." Daisy accepted the coffee gratefully, cradling it between her palms. "What happens now?" Preston took a seat across from her, his own cup in hand. "I rode back at first light to check the damage. The house is gone, but the barn and smokehouse are still standing. No sign of Victor or whoever was with him." "You think there were others?" "Had to be," Preston nodded. "The fire spread too quickly for one man's work. My guess is he hired some local toughs to help him search the place." The thought of multiple men hunting for her sent a fresh wave of fear through Daisy. "We can't stay here forever." "No," Preston agreed, "but we can stay long enough to make a solid plan. Victor will expect us to flee the territory immediately. Instead, we'll bide our time, let him think he's won, then make our move when he's stopped looking." "And what move is that?" Daisy asked. Preston's expression grew serious. "That depends on what you want, Daisy. If you still want to go east to your aunt, I'll make sure you get there safely. But if you want to stay in Montana..." He hesitated, then continued, his voice lower. "If you want to build a life here, free from Victor's shadow, I'll help you fight for that too." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Daisy studied Preston's face, the earnest eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination and integrity. In the weeks she'd known him, he'd shown her nothing but respect and kindness, asking nothing in return. "I don't want to run anymore," she said finally. I want to stand my ground, I want. She took a deep breath. I want a chance at the life I should have had, something like hope flickered in Preston's eyes. Then we'll make that happen, he promised. Together. The days at the cabin fell into a rhythm. Preston hunted and fished, keeping them supplied with fresh meat. Daisy turned the sparse interior into something resembling a home, using wildflowers to brighten the table and herbs hung to dry from the rafters. They talked for hours about books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd harbored. Preston told her about his plans for the ranch, how he'd hoped to expand the herd and eventually build a larger house on the ridge overlooking the valley. It's the perfect spot, he explained one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. You can see for miles in every direction. I'd build it facing east so the morning sun would fill the kitchen. It sounds beautiful, Daisy said, trying not to imagine herself in that imaginary kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows as she prepared breakfast. Preston's hand found hers on the rough wooden bench between them. It will be, he said softly. Someday. The casual touch of his hand on hers no longer startled Daisy. Such moments had become increasingly common between them, a brush of fingers when passing a plate, a hand at the small of her back as he guided her over rough terrain during their walks, his arm around her shoulders one night when a thunderstorm had sent her into a panic, the booming reminiscent of Victor's gunshots. What did startle her was how natural it felt, how right, and how, increasingly, she found herself watching his mouth when he spoke, wondering what it would be like to kiss him. Such thoughts should have shamed her. She was, after all, still legally married. But in her heart, she had left that marriage the night she fled through the forest. Whatever legal bonds still tied her to Victor had been severed in spirit long ago. As May turned to June, Preston began making occasional trips into town, disguised enough to avoid immediate recognition, gathering information and supplies. The news he brought back was both concerning and promising. Victor's still around, he reported after one such trip. But he's drinking heavily, causing trouble. Sheriff Mills had to lock him up twice last week for brawling. Has he mentioned me? Daisy asked, setting aside the shirt she was mending. Not directly, Preston said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. But I overheard him telling some men at the saloon that he was done with women and heading to California once he settles his affairs here. Do you believe him this time? Preston considered the question. Maybe. He's selling off his livestock. Offered his land to the Hendersons at a price well below its worth. Hope fluttered in Daisy's chest. If he truly leaves, we still need to be careful, Preston cautioned. Even if he goes, there's the legal matter of your marriage to resolve. I've been thinking about that, Daisy said. If I could prove his cruelty with witnesses. Mrs. Henderson might help, Preston suggested. She's hinted more than once that she suspected what was happening in your home, and Doc Wallace treated you after that fall last winter, didn't he? Daisy nodded, remembering the broken wrist Victor had given her in a rage over an overcooked roast. The doctor knew. He never said anything directly, but he knew. That's a start, Preston said. Judge Miller is coming through in July for circuit court. If we can build a strong enough case by then. The possibility of freedom, true, legal freedom, was almost too much to hope for, yet for the first time it seemed within reach. That night, as they sat before the fire, a comfortable silence between them, Daisy found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. What happens after? She said quietly. If the divorce is granted, if Victor leaves, what then? Preston set aside the piece of wood he'd been whittling. What do you want to happen? I want. Daisy began, then faltered. How could she tell him that what she wanted was him, that somewhere amid the fear and flight, she had fallen in love with this quiet, honorable man? I want a home, she said instead. Security, a life where I make my own choices. Preston's eyes, when they met hers, held such warmth that Daisy's breath caught. And would those choices include staying here in Montana? They might, she whispered, if I had a reason to stay. Preston set his whittling knife on the table and moved to sit beside her on the small bench. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he took her hand in his. I hope you find a reason, he said, his voice low and earnest. Because I've grown rather accustomed to having you around, Daisy Zimmerman. Before she could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, a question, not a demand. Daisy answered by leaning into the kiss, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her palm. When they broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he murmured, "but I'm not sorry." "Neither am I," Daisy admitted, a smile blooming on her lips. It was the first of many such moments in the days that followed stolen kisses while gathering berries, hands entwined as they walked along the stream. Quiet confessions of growing feelings exchanged in the soft darkness after the lamps were extinguished. They were careful, respectful of the boundaries imposed by Daisy's still legal marriage and the shadow of her past. But with each passing day, the future they might share became clearer, more tangible. By the end of June, Preston had rebuilt enough of the ranch house to make it habitable. "It's time to go back," he told Daisy one morning. "Victor's been gone 2 weeks now. Word in town is he took the stage to Bozeman, heading west from there." "Do you think it's safe?" Daisy asked, anxiety creeping back after weeks of relative peace. "As safe as it'll ever be," Preston replied. "And if we want to present your case to Judge Miller next month, we need to start gathering testimonies. That means being seen." They returned to the ranch under cover of darkness. The new house was smaller than the original, just 3 rooms, hastily constructed, but Preston had already ordered lumber for expansion. "It's temporary," he assured Daisy as he showed her the simple bedroom he'd prepared for her. "Just until we can build something proper." The "we" didn't escape her notice, nor did the way his eyes lingered on hers, full of promise. The following days were a flurry of activity. Preston arranged meetings with potential witnesses, Mrs. Henderson, who tearfully confirmed she'd seen Daisy's bruises; Doc Wallace, who agreed to testify about treating injuries inconsistent with Daisy's explanations; even Sheriff Mills, who acknowledged he'd had suspicions about Victor's character. "It's a strong case," Preston told Daisy as they sat on the porch of the new house one evening, a week before Judge Miller's arrival. "With these testimonies plus the evidence of his abandonment, I think you have a real chance." Daisy's hand found his on the bench between them. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I wouldn't have had the courage to fight without you." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious. "You had the courage the moment you ran from him, Daisy. All I did was give you a safe place to catch your breath." "You gave me much more than that," she whispered, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to his lips. The sound of approaching hooves jerked them apart. Preston was on his feet in an instant, hand moving to the gun at his hip. Daisy's heart hammered against her ribs as a rider emerged from the twilight. It wasn't Victor. Sheriff Mills reined in his horse at the bottom of the porch steps, removing his hat. "Evening, Fletcher, Mrs. Zimmerman." "Sheriff," Preston acknowledged, his stance relaxing slightly. "What brings you out this way?" Mills dismounted, his expression grim. "News I thought you should hear from me rather than town gossip." He glanced at Daisy, his eyes sympathetic. "It's about your husband, madam." Ice flooded Daisy's veins. "Has he returned?" "No, madam, he won't be returning." Mills cleared his throat. "Got word today from the sheriff in Bozeman. Victor Zimmerman was killed in a saloon fight 3 nights ago, pulled a knife on the wrong cowboy." The world seemed to tilt beneath Daisy's feet. Preston's arm came around her waist, steadying her. "You're certain?" Preston asked, his voice carefully controlled. Mills nodded. "Body was identified by several witnesses who knew him. No question it's him." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Zimmerman." Daisy opened her mouth, then closed it, unsure what response was expected. Should she pretend grief for the man who had terrorized her? Relief felt inappropriate, yet it was washing through her in overwhelming waves. "Thank you for bringing the news, Sheriff," Preston said, filling the awkward silence. "We appreciate your discretion." Mills replaced his hat. "Figured you'd want to know right away." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Zimmerman, not many in town will be mourning him. Man made no friends in these parts." After the sheriff departed, Daisy remained frozen on the porch, trying to process the sudden, unexpected freedom that had been thrust upon her. "Daisy," Preston's voice was gentle, "are you all right?" "I don't know," she admitted, turning to face him. "Is it terrible that I feel relieved?" Preston shook his head. "No, it's honest. I never wished him dead," she whispered. "I just wanted to be free of him. I know." Preston drew her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "And now you are." That night, Daisy cried not for Victor but for the years lost to fear, for the young woman who had once believed in love and had it twisted into something ugly. Preston held her through it all, a solid presence in the darkness, asking nothing, offering everything. In the morning, a new reality dawned. She was a widow now, not a fugitive, free to build whatever life she chose, wherever she chose. Over breakfast, Preston watched her with careful eyes. "What will you do now?" he asked finally. Daisy set down her coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "You're free," Preston said simply. "No need for divorce proceedings, no legal battles. You could go anywhere, do anything." Understanding bloomed in Daisy's heart. He was offering her a choice, a real choice, perhaps the first she'd had in years. "Is that what you want?" she asked softly. "For me to go," Preston's eyes, when they met hers, held such vulnerability that it stole her breath. "What I want," he said, his voice low and fervent, "is for you to stay here with me, but only if that's what you want too." Daisy rose from her chair and moved around the table to stand before him. Slowly, deliberately, she took his face between her hands. "Preston Fletcher," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "From the moment you found me hiding in your smokehouse, you've shown me what it means to be treated with respect, with kindness. You've shown me what love should be." Preston's hands came up to circle her wrists, his thumbs caressing the sensitive skin there. "Is that a yes?" he asked, hope brightening his features. "It's a yes," Daisy confirmed, leaning down to brush her lips against his. "I want to stay. I want to build that house on the ridge with you. I want everything a life with you promises." The kiss that followed sealed the promise between them, not a first kiss, but perhaps the first without shadows hanging over it. When they broke apart, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Daisy," he whispered. "I think I've loved you since that first night when you looked at me with such trust, despite everything you'd been through." "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling like coming home, "and I'm not afraid anymore." They were married in August, a small ceremony in the newly rebuilt church in town. Mrs. Henderson wept openly in the front pew, and even Sheriff Mills appeared moved as he stood as Preston's best man. The house on the ridge was completed by autumn, a sprawling, sturdy structure with wide windows that indeed filled the kitchen with morning light. As promised, Preston built it facing east, so that each day began with sunshine streaming across the breakfast table where they sat together, planning the day ahead. By the following spring, Daisy's garden surrounded the house with color, and the sound of her laughter had become as familiar as the wind in the pines. The fear that had once been her constant companion faded a little more each day, replaced by the quiet certainty of Preston's love. On a warm evening in May, 1 year after they had hidden together in the hunting cabin, Preston returned from town with a special surprise, a rocking chair for the porch, intricately carved and polished to a warm glow. "What's the occasion?" Daisy asked as he set it in place. Preston's smile was tender as he drew her into his arms. "I thought you might need it soon, somewhere comfortable to sit while you watch the sunset." His hand moved to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "For both of you." Daisy's eyes widened. "How did you know? I only just realized myself." "You've been humming in the mornings," Preston said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And you put sugar in the beans yesterday." A laugh bubbled up from Daisy's throat. "And that told you I'm expecting? That and the way you've been glowing these past weeks." His expression grew serious. "Are you happy about it?" In answer, Daisy took his hand and placed it more firmly against her abdomen. "Our child will never know fear," she promised. "Only love, the kind you taught me was possible." As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley they now called home, Daisy sat in her new rocking chair with Preston beside her, his hand in hers. From this vantage point, they could see for miles the ranch buildings below, the herds in the pastures, the road that led to town, and beyond that, the vast, open country that had once seemed so threatening but now represented only possibility. "You ever think about that night?" Daisy asked softly. "When you found me in the smokehouse," Preston's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about how easily it could have gone differently if I hadn't returned when I did, if you'd chosen another direction to run. But you did." "And I didn't." Daisy squeezed his hand. "And now we're here." The future stretched before them, bright, uncertain in its details but secure in its foundation. There would be challenges, of course, Life in the Montana Territory demanded resilience and hard work. But as Daisy looked at the man beside her, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. As twilight deepened into night, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky, Preston leaned over to place a gentle kiss on Daisy's lips. "Welcome home," he whispered, the words a promise fulfilled, a new beginning and the end of her long journey from fear to love.